You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks, and I'm sitting here with my friend and yours, Michael Kaufman of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mike, you just got back from another field study to Ukraine with some colleagues. Tell us about it.
It was a very interesting trip. We just got back about a week ago, and I am now in the process of working through the findings, and hopefully, there will be several podcasts that folks who follow Russia continuously can tune into, where I, Rob Lee, and others are going to discuss the details. But I'm happy to share some of the big picture insights with you in this discussion.
What are the three big things that you discovered or learned more about?
So the first is that, at least at the tactical level, a lot of this war now comes down to who is more effective in employing drones and various drone strike capabilities, and that's what's determining initiative on the ground. I think what I found has changed in the last couple of months, unfortunately, is that while Ukraine has led both at innovation and in the quality of its drone forces, establishing a line of drones initiative, and sort of overall being much better organized and integrated in how it uses drones in support of the fight, because it doesn't have the same material means that Russia does when it comes to artillery or the same material advantage. Russian forces have been catching up. They've gotten organized. They're deploying their own lead drone units called Rubicon, and they have a much more structured approach to the drone fight. So that advantage that Ukraine has diminished in the last couple of months. And that's one of the factors driving the dynamics on the battlefield. The second is that the Russian summer offensive, or at least how it's editorially called in the press, really started in late March, and it's likely to go through the fall. And I think that it's essentially going to go in waves as the Russian military seems to be still meeting or actually exceeding its manpower recruitment quota, and is going to be pushing most likely through the summer and the fall. And I think it's going to be a rather challenging time. When I came back, the situation was difficult as expected. It had worsened since the last trip in February, but I anticipated as much. I think that the honest view is the front's not about to collapse, but Ukrainian forces will be losing territory in the coming months.
You made an interesting point to me when we were chatting a couple days ago about how the front is being carved out into these salients and how Russia is taking advantage of that.
Yeah, if you look at the front, rather than something that looks like an even or defensible line, it essentially looks like six big salients, as though six big bites have been taken out of it. And the ones most covered in the press are Pokrovsk, which is in a rather dire situation right now, and Konstantinovka. But there are several others, and Russian forces are also trying to push along the western edge of Zaporizhia by the river. And so what you see is Russian forces essentially like fingers trying to advance at the same time all the way down from Kharkiv through Donetsk, pressuring Ukraine on a broad front. And part of the way they're fighting is they're trying to create these pockets, then to cut Ukrainian logistics with longer-range fiber optic cable drones, and then to collapse the whole pocket and press the Ukrainian forces out of it. It's an approach that has led to steady gains for the Russian military, although their casualties are still quite high because they're mostly fighting with dismounted infantry right now and trying to conserve the use of equipment.
Ukraine claims they're going to be rolling out some sort of drone wall as a response to this. What do you make of that? What even is that?
So there are several initiatives in Ukraine. A lot of them, I think, really started coming into play last fall. First is line of drones. That's basically focusing on 5 drone units, and expanding them. I think that Ukraine is trying to take a more systematized approach and having larger drone units expand into regiments and brigades, and trying to lock down parts of the front. Russia has to some extent tried to copy this initiative and build its own line of drones, except theirs is an offensive one, right? Where they have specialized units that are focused on specific parts of the fight. And then there's another sort of wall of drones, you could call it, or a line of drones, that is focused on air defense intercept. That's going to be essentially a set of units that specialize in taking out Russian Shahed long-range one-way attack drones, Garpia, and other ones, hopefully along the front as well. And so you essentially are looking at a Ukrainian effort that's largely emphasizing drone units for establishing defeat zones, for treating Russian forces, but also for intercepting a lot of the incoming Russian strike abilities. Last point on this. While I was there, the volume of attacks by Russian drones and missiles on Kiev, on other cities, and Ukrainian infrastructure had visibly increased dramatically. I'm talking 10 to 15-fold compared to last year. If last year in June you might have seen 500 Shahed-type drones, then this year in June, July, you could see 500, 600, over 700 in one night's attack. So we're talking thousands per month. But Ukraine is now scaling production of interceptor drones. So it's probably going to be able to deal with this problem, hopefully in the coming months, if they're able to deploy this sufficiently.
There's this deal that the U.S. government's supposedly about to ink with Ukraine, a $30 billion investment for co-production of drones. How can Ukraine reasonably do both, supply its own war effort while working with the U.S. to scale up our own drone capabilities?
Well, Ukraine's main problem is capital. Ukraine has the production capacity, it lacks the capital. Secondarily, there's also contracting issues as well. I mean, there were problems earlier this year when the Ministry of Digital Transformation had to hand off contracting to the Ministry of Defense. And in general, the problem Ukraine has is Ukraine significantly expanded production capacity, and it has a lot of really interesting companies working on manufacturing drones, but they really lack capital and they lack foreign exchange. So this is where I think deals like this are both a good bet for Ukraine. They're also a good bet for the United States. I think part of the reason people are pushing them is that the Trump administration wants to see us supporting Ukraine, not as something that we're doing altruistically, but as something that actually helps the United States. Let's point out there are a number of Western companies in Ukraine. As you know, most of the big Western companies that are in the drone industry are there, either testing their drones or trying to develop them, or even making them, trying to sell them.
Let's zoom out. Your visit happened around the same time as some pretty intense political drama. Before your visit, Zelensky shuffled out the prime minister. Why did Zelensky replace the prime minister?
The rumor that Shmyhal might get replaced had been around for quite a few years. He's been one of the longer-serving prime ministers, and I don't have a good answer for you, except that a cabinet shuffle had been in the offing for quite some time. He's put Shmyhal into the role of Minister of Defense. Umerov has been moved into the role of Alexander Litvinenko, and is probably going to focus on these negotiations now. My own sense that the cabinet was just long overdue for a reshuffle, but this doesn't make that much of a difference, to be very honest with you, Ryan, because everyone understands that in Ukraine, things are run by the presidential administration, and the presidential administration consists of only a couple of folks, and the leading two people are obviously Zelensky and Yermak. And so basically moving these deck chairs around isn't going to dramatically alter how things go in Ukraine. They also changed out the ambassador here to the United States.
There's a rumor that the Minister of Defense might become the ambassador to the U.S.
No, he won't. He's taking over a kind of, I won't say relatively empty portfolio, but a portfolio that can be focused on almost anything. And there was a promotion for Fedorov, the Minister of Digital Transformation, to First Deputy Minister.
Of course, the bigger drama was Zelensky's decision to try to rush through these reforms, putting these two independent corruption offices under the supervision of the General Prosecutor's Office, which of course is under the government's control, which was met with fury both in Ukraine and abroad.
Yeah, so I think that probably was the most controversial and the worst political decision that Zelensky has made since the start of this war by some margin. And it was interesting that his administration was surprised by the fury and the protests of Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainian civil society, against these decisions, which shows to some extent detachment from the ground reality in Kyiv. I mean, the reason he did this, from what I understand from talking to colleagues and folks who follow this in Kyiv, is NABU's anti-corruption court was conducting an investigation on several individuals, and it could potentially affect Zelensky's, let's say, close circle. One of them had already fled Ukraine because of this investigation, and they were looking for a quick way to shut it down. And what essentially happened is they had the Rada then vote to place the anti-corruption courts under the jurisdiction of the general prosecutor, which could then very easily kill this investigation or reassign it to somebody like the SBU, who knows, but essentially would eliminate it as an independent body. And after the uproar, and I think some criticism as well from the West, although it was probably lukewarm.
I mean, European leaders were pretty outspoken about it, actually.
Yeah, they were. And I don't know what if anything, Kyiv heard from Trump administration, but my sense here is also people were pretty disappointed by his decision.
It was, frankly, a reminder that corruption is still a serious problem in Ukraine.
Yeah, and there were several major pieces about authoritarian trends in the presidential administration, one in The Economist, one in FT, one in Kiev Independent a couple weeks before this. And so it was almost ironic that a decision like this comes out.
And these were by far the biggest protests in Ukraine since the war started, across the country, not just in the capital.
Absolutely. And folks in the Ukrainian military are quite unhappy too, because the sort of ethos or mantra is that not only are they fighting to keep Ukraine from being occupied by Russia, but they've also always fought to keep Ukraine from becoming a country like Russia, right? So a lot of folks basically say, what is the point of having spent years fighting if people are going to be making these decisions on the domestic political scene that's going to make Ukraine appear much more of an authoritarian country? Ukrainian civil society, I think, won't be willing to deal with this. But I should also add that they're now trying to pass a new law that Zelensky claims will, make these courts independent again. We'll see, because now the Ukrainian Rada doesn't want to vote for this new law, and it's become a bit of a political mess.
We are going to take a quick break from our conversation with Mike to talk about breaks in the episodes. We're going to start doing advertising more often, and we approach advertising differently than most podcasts. We're not just going to put standard ad copy. What we're going to do in the middle of these episodes is sort of insert a mini episode, a very tightly edited 2-minute conversation with an executive or founder of an organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, having some sort of thoughtful conversation about what it is they do and how it ties into national security. If you'd like to learn more about advertising with War on the Rocks, which will include a pre-roll of about 30 seconds, and then one of these mid-rolls that includes a longer, tightly edited conversation in the middle of one of our episodes, which is listened to, by the way, by up to 100,000 people, contact us at War on the Rocks. And you could do that by simply emailing editor@warontherocks.com and make some reference to advertising on our podcast in the subject line. Again, that's editor, EDITOR, @warontherocks.com. And now back to my conversation with Michael Kaufman. In our last episode, we discussed how Ukraine was going to be in a pretty bad place between A, the terrible manpower policies of Zelensky's government, but B, also drying up security packages from the West and most notably from the United States. And it seems like the United States, with its NATO partners, has found a way to resolve this by selling large arms packages to our European allies with the understanding that they will then give them to Ukraine. Do you want to talk a bit about this?
Sure. I think that was a big breakthrough for Ukraine. One of the things that was far less certain this year were external factors, because they influenced the course of the war, and it just wasn't clear if Ukraine was going to be able to maintain Western support and, most importantly, American support, especially in the early months. So now it seems that Trump administration is going to continue providing Ukraine with munitions, with military capabilities, that they've made a deal with Root essentially to have Europeans buy them. Now, we are talking about what is ultimately more of the same, the kind of packages that are being provided by the Biden administration.
Air defense, artillery.
Patriot missiles, GMLRS for HIMARS, artillery. There isn't anything really exciting or new in those packages, but nonetheless, it's pretty important for sustaining Ukraine. It now helps to answer a very important question. Is Ukraine going to falter ultimately in the front line for lack of Western material support? And increasingly, it looks like probably not. It's not going to get a lot more. It's probably going to be bureaucratically a lot more complicated than the PDAs that it was getting from Biden administration. But nonetheless, support's going to be there. And this willingness to sell to Europeans, I think, is a big change in Trump administration policy. And I felt that when I was in Ukraine, because when we were there before in February, Ukrainians were very worried because it felt like the United States was walking away from Ukraine, and it almost looked like the United States was going to side with Russia against Ukraine. Now you come back in July and you can actually see the shift in attitudes and perceptions, that it feels in Ukraine as though they finally have Trump on side, that they've won Trump over and they have the United States back in Ukraine's corner, as opposed to kind of being an arbitrator and saying, this isn't our war and, you and the Russians should figure it out. So that, I think, was a big change, and that's an important one for Ukraine. Maybe on the negative side, because you started us off with a quip about Manpower, that situation has not improved. And from what I saw at the front line, that's one of the leading issues.
Worse than last time, would you say? Worse than your last visit a few months ago?
Certainly not better. And looking at how long men have to spend in forward positions without rotation at this point, and at how stretched the force is, what I think is that Ukraine can hold like this, or at least hold Russia to incremental gains for some time. But I am a bit worried that colleagues in the West looking at the situation are a bit too lackadaisical or blasé because Ukraine has proven so resilient. And in the past, let's be honest, like last fall when the situation looked quite precarious, the predictions that Russia would keep gaining offensive momentum were not borne out once we got into December. But this year, the Russian military is advancing at a higher rate of gain. And it's not enough for big breakthroughs, and it's probably going to spend the bulk of this year fighting for the rest of Donetsk. But folks should avoid a kind of boiling the frog effect by looking at the situation and saying, yeah, it's not great, but it's been not great for a long time, because things can change.
Another question about the front before we pivot back to some larger diplomatic and economic issues. We haven't talked about this question in a while. Ukraine has struggled with issues of command, especially above the battalion level when it comes to organizing operations. From what you've seen in your repeated visits, let's say this one and the most recent one before that, how do you feel like Ukraine is adapting and learning and developing brigade commanders, battalion commanders, corps commanders?
So some aspects of this have gotten better and others haven't changed, and I'll explain why. In Ukraine, the real final command level is that of the brigade commander. Okay, and some brigade commanders are good, others are not as good, and every brigade kind of has its own culture. But the challenge Ukraine had was that there wasn't really much of a command layer above the brigade. The sort of tactical groups, the OTUs, were all these virtual command layers that didn't do much except annoy all the brigade commanders and try to micromanage their force alongside them. Finally, Ukraine is implementing this corps system, and the corps, unfortunately, because Ukraine doesn't have the ability to move units or shift them from one part of the line to another, the corps are just going to be made where the units are grouped together. Okay, so basically you're looking at parts of the line, and that's a corps, and that's a corps, and that's a corps. But the corps are, I think, a positive development. Hopefully they'll eliminate.
Do they have real power, or does the commander of land forces still kind of control where forces get shuffled?
It's complicated. So the commander-in-chief Syrskyi still controls where forces get shuffled. No, they don't have real power. In Ukraine, there's a sort of PO reporting system where you have the commander-in-chief and the general staff. You have the OSAV, which is the theater command, Horditsa and Tavria. Horditsa covers most of what people know to be the front, all the way from Kharkiv through Donetsk, and Tavria covers Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Odessa. If you look at these different commanders involved, ultimately the problem comes down to too much micromanagement centralization, but secondarily, no real level of command above the brigade. And the Corps will hopefully solve that, because the Corps commander and the Corps staff will then be helping brigades and will have some kind of enablers that they can deploy to brigades that they care about, that are kind of their units along that part of the front. And I think finally the brigade commander might get some support, some backup, and somebody will run the fight more cohesively rather than this virtual command layer with an ever-changing cast of colonels, and most of the people in that command layer aren't that great, which is why they were sort of promoted up there by brigade anyway in an effort to get rid of them. And what you're really looking for, the corps are not really corps, they're more like divisions, if we're going to look at analogous organizations in the West.
Yeah, that's why I asked about corps and not divisions.
To me, it's still a work in progress, and it will take some time for it to show results. Last point. The real challenge that I saw, and this is increasingly clear to me, is that given some of the manpower issues and given the way the fight's evolving, it would make the most sense for Ukraine to maximize attrition of Russian forces, which they are trying to do, but to do this by getting out of the pockets and the salients that they're in, and when they have to, shifting to defensible terrain. So they don't have episodes like Kursk where Ukrainian forces are forced out, abandon a lot of equipment, have to walk out on foot, and then give up even more terrain in this kind of withdrawal. The challenge they have is that brigade commanders cannot withdraw from their positions. If they do, they'll be replaced. They'll be fired.
So let's say whoever actually led the retreat operation in Kursk would have been more likely to be held accountable for leading an earlier but well-organized retreat operation than what actually happened, which left all this equipment behind and was kind of a black eye for Ukraine.
Yeah, because commanders can't retreat on their own initiative, and then what often happens is brigade commanders or battalion commanders...
Even though the fact that Ukraine was about to lose Kursk was no secret to anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. It was quite foreseeable. But the challenge is that then individual commanders are forced to make decisions to save their own force. Once they make that decision, other commanders around them will also probably make a decision to save their troops. And then you start getting a withdrawal that isn't necessarily even ordered by higher echelons, just because of how the situation is evolving. And then the commanders actually make those decisions and take initiative. They'll be blamed later. But the real reason for this problem is that Ukraine has a policy of not one step back, okay? The problem with that policy is very often in a fight, your position is disadvantageous. I kind of nicknamed this Bakhmut syndrome, where you end up in a fight where you're being enveloped, the terrain's not favorable, but you're there anyway, losing experienced troops.
Yeah, for anyone curious who are newer to the show, go back and listen to our conversations on this show during the Battle of Bakhmut. It was pretty grim.
So the challenge you have is that the way Russian forces are fighting now, they are trying to create these pockets and then to displace Ukrainian forces out of them. And Ukrainian units often want to be able to conduct a mobile and maneuver defense, but they can't. They have to hold the line. And a lot of folks blame Syrskyi for that, but the truth is that he is implementing what is the actual policy. And the policy stems from political decision-making at the top, which is that Ukrainian forces should not give up any terrain. Even if it's unfavorable terrain, even if they could retreat to better terrain elsewhere, and even if it makes sense to conduct more of a mobile defense because of the symmetry in the density of forces, and that would be much easier to attrit Russian forces and trade some terrain for attrition rather than trying to hold positions that are very difficult to hold. But so this has been kind of the, I think, inner churn that I've seen over the last couple of years between those at the brigade level and below versus those above the brigade commander level. And also the challenge of the military is ultimately implementing a policy that's set in Kiev.
So our last segment in this conversation, President Trump has gotten even more impatient with Putin and has shortened the amount of time that he's willing to let Putin come to some sort of ceasefire before he enacts secondary sanctions and supports this bill that Lindsey Graham has written. And I just want to go through its key points before we start talking about whether it will even happen and what it would mean. But basically, it allows the president to determine that Russia is refusing to negotiate a peace settlement or violating a negotiated peace agreement or initiating another invasion of Ukraine or attempting to overthrow or subvert Ukraine's government. And within 15 days of that determination and every 90 days thereafter, the president must sanction the entire Russian political leadership and any foreign person who knowingly supplies defense items or supports undermining Ukraine or works in key Russian economic sectors. And it also puts more sanctions on Russian banks, people who run those banks. It prohibits the listing of securities of sanctioned Russian entities. It restricts U.S. exports to Russia of U.S.-made energy products and on U.S. investment in Russia's energy sector. It sanctions any foreign person knowingly enabling Russian energy production, which I think is kind of big. A ban on importing Russian uranium or any uranium sourced from Russia via third countries, sanctions any individuals and foreign governments involved in sourcing Russian uranium, and puts 500% tariffs on all goods and services imported from Russia, and also puts tariffs, those same level of tariffs, on any country, including China, India, and Brazil, that buys Russian origin oil, gas, uranium, or petrochemicals. So this is pretty aggressive legislation. Do you think it will actually happen? And do you think it would have much of an effect on Russia's ability to stay in the fight?
So I think that this is engineered by Lindsey Graham to give Trump a set of tools to essentially coerce Putin into some kind of agreement. I think, as far as I understand it, Trump administration only agreed to this bill if it didn't require them to do this, but if they had it as an option. And so then much depends on your, mine, or whoever's listening, personal view on whether Trump is going to use any of these. I think that Trump's ultimatum of 50 days to Putin is interesting, although he most recently said now he's going to revise it to maybe 10 days or 12 days. When I was in Ukraine, folks were certainly excited to see that he had issued a 50-day ultimatum. I myself am skeptical, having already seen this play out several times. And when a colleague recently here in DC told me that they think this time the 50-day ultimatum is for real, it reminded me of what Samuel Johnson said about second marriages being the triumph of hope over experience. So I think maybe we'll see. I'm a bit skeptical, but it's clear that Trump's attitude has changed, and with that comes a shift in the overall administration's approach. So something is going to happen. He's clearly going to do something to Russia. On the economic front, the challenge with all these tariffs and sanctions is, first, it's very unlikely the U.S. is going to put hundreds of percents of tariffs on China, on India, and major trading partners.
We did just come to a trade agreement with China.
Yeah.
So it seems like...
It seems ridiculous. And Trump wasn't willing to sustain 145% trade tariffs on China for long. So 500% tariffs seems like a pretty large paper threat. Second, other things that Russia sells like energy, China and India don't have very easy access to alternatives from my point of view. I mean, of course, yes, other countries, Saudi Arabia could pump more, but the price of energy would spike significantly. Russia puts out well over 7 million barrels of oil per day. You're simply not going to find that output as easily on the market.
There are other countries that could increase their own production, but you're right, 7 million barrels a day is a lot.
They could, just not quickly by the volumes required, right? That's what folks need to keep in mind. So don't know what Trump will sanction, but yes, it could have effect. It could certainly have effect on the other players, and it might start pushing Moscow into a direction of being more compromising, because right now, a lot of negotiations, what I understand, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are being seen largely as performative. There's nothing really going on there. But either way, it's good. Trump administration is getting impatient and are still looking for ways to now do what a lot of folks were hoping they were going to do at the beginning of the year, which is start by pressuring Moscow and start by building the instruments that could at least get some kind of leverage over Russia. Even if it's not a lot, but at least then to show to Russia that there will be real economic costs down the line, or things that they can't necessarily easily account for or predict going into 2026, in the hope that if the war reaches a point of diminishing returns, given Ukraine's strategy is principally to make the war futile for Russia, right? To make this a war of diminishing returns, then Moscow will then want to compromise, which I still personally find unlikely. I increasingly am of the mind that this war is going to go into 2026 now.
Sad note to end, but unfortunately, these are always tragic conversations. But thanks for joining, Mike.
Thanks for having me back.
And thank you for listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. And of course, you can hear more from Mike Kaufman if you become a member at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.